Today's story: Horrors of War. Gus had always been a deep sleeper, the kind who could slumber through thunderstorms and noisy neighbors without a single stir. But on this particular night, the universe conspired to break his peaceful slumber with a tremendous explosion that rattled the very foundations of his old, creaky house. The explosion was so thunderous that it sent vibrations rippling through the walls and floor, jolting Gus from his dreams. He shot up in bed, heart pounding in his chest, disoriented and bewildered. It was the middle of the night, and his room was bathed in eerie darkness, with only the dim glow of the street lamp outside seeping through the curtains. What the hell was that? Gus mumbled to himself, rubbing his eyes as if trying to shake off the remnants of a surreal dream. But the lingering scent of burnt powder in the air and the faint, distant sound of sirens told him that this was no dream. Throwing aside his tangled blankets, Gus swung his legs over the side of the bed and slipped his feet into his worn-out slippers. He fumbled for his glasses on the nightstand, squinting as he adjusted them on his face. Outside, the neighborhood was a chaotic tableau of flashing red and blue lights, and a chorus of sirens filled the air. Gus stumbled down the narrow staircase, one hand clutching the wooden railing for support. The explosion had sent shivers down his spine, and he knew he had to find out what had happened. He reached the front door, flung it open, and was met with a surreal sight. The night sky was painted in shades of orange and red, as if a celestial canvas had been set ablaze. Thick plumes of smoke billowed into the air, their sinister tendrils illuminated by the flickering flames. In the distance, the source of the explosion became apparent. It was the old munitions factory that had been abandoned for years. As Gus hurried down the dimly lit street, he saw people running in every direction, their faces contorted with fear and panic. Some clutched their pets, others gripped the hands of terrified children, and a few were carrying precious belongings hastily grabbed in their flight from danger. The normally peaceful neighborhood had transformed into a chaotic scene of disarray. Amidst the commotion, a neighbor he recognized, Mrs. Thompson, a kind woman in her 60s, briefly stopped him. Her eyes were wide with alarm as she gasped for breath. "Gus," she panted, her voice trembling, "the war has started. Our neighbor country launched the first attack. It's not just news on TV anymore, it's real, it's here." Gus felt a chill run down his spine as Mrs. Thompson's words sank in. The tension between their country and the neighboring nation had been simmering for years, but he had always thought of it as a distant conflict. Something he observed from the safety of his living room on the evening news. Now, the consequences of that tension were unfolding right before his eyes. He could hear distant sirens, not the familiar sound of fire trucks or ambulances, but the ominous wail of air raid alarms. It was a stark reminder that the world he had known was changing rapidly, and the specter of war hung heavy in the air. With a heavy heart and a growing sense of urgency, Gus hastily made his way back to his house. The panic in the streets had intensified, and the distant rumble of fighter jets overhead served as a grim reminder that the danger was not abating. He knew he had to act quickly to secure his belongings and find a safer place. Entering his apartment, Gus moved with purpose. He grabbed a sturdy duffel bag from his closet and began filling it with the few valuable possessions he owned. He carefully placed family heirlooms, important documents, and cherished photographs into the bag. His heart ached as he glanced around at the apartment he had spent the last 4 years renovating. The memories of late nights spent painting walls, the satisfaction of fixing a leaky faucet, and the joy of making it a cozy home all flooded back. His hands trembled as he packed away the mementos that held the essence of his life. His hands trembled as he packed away the mementos that held the essence of his life. Each item was a piece of himself, a part of the story he had crafted in this apartment. The weight of leaving it all behind pressed down on him, making his heart feel impossibly heavy. As he zipped up the duffel bag, Gus took one last look around the apartment. He knew that he might never return, that the home he had worked so hard to create would soon be a distant memory. With a deep sigh, he turned and made his way to the door. Outside, the city was in turmoil. People rushed by with anxiety etched on their faces, and the distant sounds of explosions and sirens were a constant reminder of the chaos that had descended upon them. Gus locked the door behind him and started his car, which he had loaded with his most essential belongings earlier. With a heavy heart and tears threatening to spill from his eyes, he drove away from the city that had been his home for so long. As Gus's car rolled to a stop in the gravel driveway of his mother's countryside home, he took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in his mind. The air was filled with the familiar scent of the countryside, a comforting blend of earth and nature. The soft rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant chirping of birds offered a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind in the city. Katrina, his mother, stood on the porch, her eyes filled with tears that glistened in the soft sunlight. Her face bore the marks of countless sleepless nights and anxious days. As Gus stepped out of the car, she rushed forward and enveloped him in a tight, tearful hug. "Gus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so worried." "Thank goodness you're safe." Gus held his mother tightly, feeling her warmth and the love that had always been a constant in his life. He knew that his arrival had brought her immense relief in the midst of her fears. "I'm here, Mom," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "I couldn't stay in the city. It's chaos out there." Katrina pulled back slightly, her hands resting on his shoulders as she looked into his eyes. "I know, Gus. It's a frightening time. But I'm just glad you're here with me." As they walked into the cozy living room, Katrina couldn't hide the concern that still lingered in her eyes. She poured 2 cups of tea and sat down with her son. "Gus," she began, her voice quivering, "I can't help but worry about your brother Raoul. He's still in the army, and with all that's happening." Gus nodded, his own worry for his younger brother gnawing at him. "I know, Mom. I've been thinking about him too. We need to find out how he's doing, make sure he's safe." Katrina placed a hand on Gus's, her eyes filled with maternal concern. "I've tried calling him, but the lines are jammed. We'll have to keep trying. And we'll pray for his safety, Gus." Gus squeezed his mother's hand, the bond between them strengthening in the face of uncertainty. "We'll keep trying, Mom. We'll do everything we can to make sure Raoul is okay." Days turned into an anxious blur as Gus and his mother, Katrina, made countless calls to friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have information about Raoul's whereabouts. Their worry was palpable, and the uncertainty of not knowing his status weighed heavily on them. Neighbors rallied around them, offering support and sharing any information they could gather. Together, they formed a tight-knit community united by concern for their loved ones in the midst of the growing conflict. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Katrina received a visit from their neighbor's daughter, Sarah, who had been working in the army as a communications specialist. Sarah's eyes held both weariness and relief as she shared the news they had all been desperately seeking. "Mrs. Katrina, Mr. Gus," she began, "I managed to dig through the records, and I can confirm that Raoul is in the reserves. He hasn't been deployed to the battlefield. At least not yet. I think he's safe for the time being." Relief washed over Gus and Katrina like a soothing balm. The weight that had been pressing down on their hearts began to lift, and they couldn't thank Sarah enough for her efforts in providing clarity during such a tumultuous time. As the days passed, the neighborhood continued to support one another, sharing information and offering solace. Gus and Katrina still couldn't fully shake the unease that lingered, but knowing that Raoul was out of immediate danger brought them a measure of peace. Then, one fateful morning, an official-looking envelope arrived in the mail. Gus's hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a letter from the government. The contents confirmed his deepest fears. He had been called to start training for the army. Gus stared at the letter, his heart heavy with the realization that the peaceful life he had known was about to change dramatically. He knew that he had a duty to his country, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead filled him with a mixture of determination and apprehension. Gus turned to his mother, who had been standing beside him, and met her gaze. Katrina started crying, and her tears made Gus feel like his life turned upside down. For Gus, all these days felt like a weird dream that was just about to end. A dream from which you wake up, laugh at the absurdity of it, and forget it forever. However, sadly it was not the case, as the cruelty of reality couldn't be more present. 2 weeks later, with a heavy heart, but a sense of duty burning within him, Gus made the difficult decision to answer the call and join the army. He did so with the hope that he could be reunited with his brother, Raoul, and that they could both return home safely, side by side, just as they had always been. Gus's army training was an arduous journey that tested his limits physically and mentally. From the moment he arrived at the military base, his life underwent a radical transformation. The first day was an awakening. He was introduced to his drill sergeant, a stern and unyielding figure who barked orders with a ferocity that made Gus question his decision to join. As the days passed, Gus and his fellow recruits formed a tight-knit bond forged through shared hardship. They trained together, motivated each other, and endured the punishing workouts as a team. Basic combat skills were drilled into them with precision and repetition. Gus learned how to handle firearms, maintain his gear, and move tactically in various terrains. He spent countless hours on the firing range, perfecting his marksmanship under the watchful eyes of his instructors. Hand-to-hand combat training was equally demanding, teaching him techniques to defend himself and his comrades in close-quarters combat. As weeks turned into months, Gus felt himself transforming. He became stronger, more disciplined, and mentally tough. After 2 grueling months of intense army training, he and his fellow recruits had transformed from civilians into disciplined soldiers. The physical and mental conditioning had pushed them to their limits, but they had emerged stronger and more prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. The day Gus's training finally ended was marked by a solemn ceremony. Dressed in their crisp uniforms, the recruits stood in formation as their commanding officer congratulated them on their achievements. It was a moment of pride mixed with a sense of duty and fear. It was a few days after completing his training when Gus received a letter from his mother. Her handwriting trembled, and the words conveyed a sense of urgency and worry that sent a shiver down his spine. The letter informed him that Raoul had been deployed to the battlefield as a tank driver. Gus's heart sank as he read the news. The bond between the two brothers was unbreakable, and the thought of Raoul facing the dangers of war filled him with a deep sense of concern and responsibility. Gus knew that he needed to be with his brother, Raoul, on the battlefield, no matter the obstacles. With determination in his heart, he approached his commanding officer, Major Anderson, and explained the situation. He spoke of the strong bond between him and Raoul, the concern for his brother's safety, and the desire to serve alongside him. Listening to Gus's request, Major Anderson strongly refused. With an insensitive look on his face, he said to Gus, "The task would be too dangerous, not to say almost insane. If it was so easy, everyone would go in search of their relatives." Anderson added, "There is an active war zone right now. Soldiers come and go all the time. You should try to find your brother in the medic's tent." Gus's heart sank at Major Anderson's refusal. It felt as if the world was conspiring against him, preventing him from being with his brother during this critical time. He had trained tirelessly, committed himself to the army, all in the hopes of protecting Raoul. Now, he felt powerless and frustrated. Days turned into restless nights, and Gus couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of helplessness. He knew he couldn't simply sit idly by while his brother was out there on the battlefield, facing the perils of war alone. One night, a decision took root in his mind like a stubborn seed, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. Under the cover of darkness, Gus quietly slipped out of the tent where he and his fellow soldiers slept. He moved with the stealth he had honed during his training, avoiding the gaze of the sentries. His destination was the motor pool, where rows of military vehicles and motorcycles were parked. His plan was audacious. He intended to steal a motorbike and embark on a perilous journey to find Raoul himself. The risks were enormous, and Gus was well aware that he could face disciplinary actions if caught. But he couldn't let that deter him. The bond between him and his brother was unbreakable, and he couldn't bear the thought of Raoul being alone in the midst of the chaos. As Gus straddled a motorcycle and ignited the engine, the roar of the machine seemed to echo his determination. With the wind against his face and the weight of his decision pressing heavily on him, he sped into the darkness. Guided only by the hope of reuniting with Raoul and ensuring his safety on the unforgiving battlefield. A day after embarking on his perilous journey into the heart of the battlefield, Gus found himself amidst unimaginable horrors. The landscape was scarred by destruction, and the aftermath of war painted a grim picture that was difficult to comprehend. Crumbled buildings, burned-out vehicles, and the relentless echoes of distant explosions haunted his every step. As Gus explored the desolation, he was astonished by the cruelty that humans were capable of inflicting upon each other. The once thriving towns and villages were reduced to rubble, and the remnants of people's lives were scattered in the debris, children's toys, family photographs, and shattered hopes. He met countless wounded soldiers along the way, their injuries a stark testament to the brutality of war. They recounted tales of chaos and camaraderie amid the chaos, but none had any knowledge of Raoul. Gus's heart sank with each encounter, but he couldn't give up the search. His motorcycle, which had been his lifeline in this treacherous terrain, eventually broke down. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him stranded in a war-torn no-man's land. Gus knew he couldn't stay put. His determination to find Raoul pushed him forward, and he decided to abandon the motorcycle. Desperation fueled his resourcefulness. Gus scavenged for parts and tools from abandoned tanks, often working under the cover of darkness to avoid detection. He dismantled damaged tanks, salvaging what he needed to get his motorcycle back on the road. Each night, he toiled tirelessly, his hands stained with grease and dirt, his mind focused on the singular goal of reuniting with his brother. The stolen parts and tools became his lifeline, enabling him to breathe life back into his motorcycle. As Gus continued his harrowing journey through the war-torn battlefield, the scenes of devastation and unimaginable horrors he witnessed weighed heavily on his soul. The constant reminders of human cruelty and the fragility of life became unbearable. Each lifeless body he passed, each ruined building, and each shattered piece of humanity eroded his spirit. One day, as he stumbled upon a particularly gruesome scene, he found an unrecognizable dead soldier, his uniform stained with mud and blood. The soldier's lifeless eyes stared blankly at the sky, and Gus couldn't help but see his own reflection in those vacant gazes. A profound sense of futility washed over him. He began to question the purpose of his quest and the relentless pursuit of his brother in a world consumed by violence and destruction. In that moment of despair, Gus made a heart-wrenching decision. He carefully removed his identification documents from his pocket, the tangible proof of his existence in this brutal reality. With trembling hands, he placed them inside the tattered uniform of the dead soldier, sealing his fate as a nameless casualty of war. With a heavy heart, Gus faked his own death. He recognized the fragility of human life more than ever before, and he realized that his place was not on this blood-soaked battlefield. It was with his family, his mother, who needed him just as much as Raoul did. Leaving behind the grim landscape of death and destruction, Gus made a perilous journey back home, navigating the chaos of war-torn territory, all while concealing his true identity. He knew the risks of being labeled a deserter, but the love for his family and the profound shift in his perspective on life pushed him forward. Gus's return home was a bittersweet reunion with his mother, Katrina, who had feared the worst during his absence. As he stepped through the door, she rushed to him, her eyes filled with tears of relief. She held him tightly, as if afraid he might disappear once more, whispering words of gratitude that her son had come back to her unharmed. Gus had seen the darkest side of humanity on the battlefield, and it had left an indelible mark on his soul. The horrors he had witnessed had given him a profound understanding of the fragility of life and the stark importance of family bonds. In the sanctuary of his home, he found solace in the warmth of his mother's embrace, grateful for the chance to be with her once more. As the years passed, Gus chose to leave the memories of the battlefield behind. He settled in his village and became a skilled mechanic, using his talents to repair and restore the vehicles of his community. The rhythmic hum of engines and the satisfaction of mending broken parts became his refuge, a way to mend both machines and the scars that war had left on his soul. Despite his best efforts, Gus never received any news of his brother Raoul. The uncertainty of his fate weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder of the toll that war could take. But he held on to hope, a flicker of optimism that one day he might hear word of Raoul, alive and well, and that they could be reunited once more. Gus's life had taken an unexpected turn, but he remained forever grateful for the second chance at life, for the opportunity to appreciate the simple joys of family, and for the enduring love of his mother, who had stood by him through the darkest of times. And as he continued to mend the vehicles of his village, he found a measure of peace, knowing that he had come back from the brink of despair to embrace the precious moments life had to offer. If you've listened until now, make sure you like and subscribe, so you'll know when the next story comes around.